Packers close out the preseason today, so that means that it's time for a 53-man roster prediction. I'm going to also throw in at the end what I think the practice squad is going to look like as well. So let's go ahead and start with the quarterbacks. Probably the easiest position to predict on this roster. Matt LaFleur said it this week. Sean Clifford is quarterback 2. So I don't see that they're going to keep 3 by any stretch of the imagination. So I just expect that it's going to be Jordan Love and Sean Clifford. Moving on to the running back position, a little bit more, up in the air. I personally think Emmanuel Wilson has done enough to make this roster. So I go ahead and put him on here. I understand that there's a little bit of an unknown on the, pass protection angle of it. But I think he, as a running back, has shown enough that if he goes out there just almost basically on the 80-yard run alone, if we release him, he's going to get picked up by some other roster. So I think the Packers are going to consider that, and they're going to keep him on the 53, but then they'll probably keep Patrick Taylor along on the practice squad and call him up similarly to how they did last year. So the 3 that I would keep at running back would be Aaron Jones, AJ Dillon, and Emmanuel Wilson. Receivers, I struggled on whether to keep 6 or 7, to be honest. The top 4, I think, are pretty much locks, that being Christian Watson, Romeo Doubs, Jayden Reed, and actually the 4th that I would think of a lock is Malik Heath. The way he played throughout the preseason, I kind of basically wrote him in after the second preseason game. He's led the team in receptions, in receiving yards throughout the preseason, and he was out there doing a lot of different role work as well. So I think he was a lock for this roster. And then the 5th would be Samori Toure, who I think the Packers are still high on, but the performance of some of these other younger guys may have, pushed him a little bit further down the totem pole. So I've got 5 there. The 6th one I decided to keep was Dontayvion Wicks. So this one could go either way for me on either Dontayvion Wicks or Grant Dubose. I went with Wicks mostly because of the draft pedigree, and I think his injury is more of a ticky-tack kind of thing that he's going to get back sooner than later. I do fully expect that Grant Dubose will be on the practice squad, though. But let me know in the comments, what do you think? Are you a Dubose guy or a Wicks guy or Heath? Who is your final, receiver on this roster? Or would you have gone with 7 and just kept both of them? We'll get into more of kind of the breakdown of what that looks like later, though. Moving on to tight ends and H-backs, I kind of roped them all together here, especially because Josiah Deguara is going to probably play both roles pretty predominantly. I ended up keeping 4 total. So I did keep Austin Allen as the final tight end. I think he showed a bit, at least that first preseason game, he did well all around as a tight end. And he did catch a pass today, but that's pretty limited action. I think he's going to try to take on some of that Tyler Davis role, probably both on special teams and as well as a blocker, because he is a big physical guy. So hopefully he develops throughout there. So then we end up with the 4 being Luke Musgrave, Tucker Kraft, Josiah Deguara, and Austin Allen. I did consider keeping Henry Pearson around, but with the injury this past week and him not being able to go, I figured that was probably more of a practice squad type player there as well. On to the offensive line. I kept 9 on the offensive line. The first almost all of them I think are essentially locks to the roster. So I went David Bakhtiari, obviously, Elgton Jenkins, Josh Myers, Jon Runyan Jr., Zach Tom, Rasheed Walker, Yosh Nijman, Caleb Jones, and Sean Ryan. You might think, we don't have a lot of depth at the interior positions on there. I'm really kind of counting on the fact that Zach Tom is probably going to flex to the inside if it comes to that anyway. So having a little bit more depth there with Sean Ryan, it evens out a little bit. But I did want to consider that a little bit more on the practice squad as well. Before we head into the defense, I'm going to just ask you quickly, if you don't mind, like the video. If this is your first time on the channel, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future content. It really does a lot to help support the channel so I can continue to bring Packers analysis and breakdowns to you throughout the season. So thank you for all your support. And we'll just get right back into the defense here. Starting with the defensive line, I kept 5 because I don't think we're going to go much deeper than those 5 for a rotation anyway. And I went Kenny Clark, Devontae Wyatt, TJ Slayton, Colby Wooden, and Carl Brooks. I did consider Jonathan Ford for a while because he does add that depth at the nose tackle position where he's really going to be able to anchor and kind of run stuff a little bit more. But I think just the performance of both those rookies, Brooks and Wooden, really kind of set themselves apart enough to make this roster. I will keep Jonathan Ford around on the practice squad, hoping we can keep him at least. And then he'll be called up similar to Patrick Taylor for those position-specific matchup battles throughout the season, I think. Moving over to the edge, I kept a lot at edge, and mostly because I didn't think Brenton Cox Jr. would make it back on the practice squad. I think he showed a lot of tape throughout the season that he would get snatched up on somebody's active roster, and having more depth at the edge position, especially with Rashawn Gary coming back from an injury, is kind of important, especially like you can never have too many pass rushers. So I kept 6. And part of that is you get a little bit of that versatility in Lucas Van Ness as well going into the interior. But I've got Gary, Smith, Enigbari, Van Ness, Hollins, and Cox Jr. Moving on to the linebacker position. So at linebacker, I kept 5. More than I think we usually keep. We typically go somewhere around 4, but mostly special teams value, especially losing Tyler Davis. I look at linebackers being in that similar kind of mold to fill the similar types of duties on special teams as a tight end would do. So with that, I kept Tariq Carpenter, even though on the defensive side, he's probably not going to do a whole lot. He's still developing and learning that position. But I kept Campbell, Walker, McDuffie as the 3 true linebackers that are absolutely going to play there. Their backup to them would be Eric Wilson, who did a little bit better at the interior defense or interior linebacker positions, but also brings special teams value. So we've got Wilson and then Carpenter rounding out the 5th for that linebacker group. At cornerback, I also cheat a little bit here because Ennis Gaines can do both cornerback in the slot and safety. So he brings that value there. He's a good special teamser. So I kept him with the idea that he's going to be a backup for the slot. The other 4 that I kept were Alexander, Douglas, Nixon, and Valentine. I do think basically as soon as Eric Stokes is back, that Ennis Gaines would probably be one of the first ones to potentially hit the chopping block. But we'll see with the safeties as well, because I also kept 5 safeties. So we'll go right into those right now. And I do think Darnell Savage and Rudy Ford are going to start the season as the starters. I expect that's going to change a lot throughout the season. I think based on matchups and sub packages, things like that, we're going to see a big rotation of a lot of the safeties out there. I do think Anthony Johnson Jr. somewhere throughout this season is going to capture a role, and I think he's going to be the starter moving forward. But I don't think that's going to happen until week 8, 9, 10, somewhere in the middle of the season. But he's done well when he's gotten his chances out there, and he's also performed a lot of special teams roles as well. So the 5 I kept might surprise you a little bit. So I've got Savage, Ford, Anthony Johnson Jr., Tarvarius Moore, and Dallin Levitt. So going back to that special teams part, Rich Bisaccia said losing Tyler Davis was essentially like losing his right hand. If that's the case, the next man up to take that position on special teams is Dallin Levitt. Even from a different role on special teams, Dallin Levitt is that veteran that is the teamer. Like, they brought him in and Keyshawn Nixon in last year to really, beef up that special teams and get them right. And they did just that. So I think they're going to want to keep him around just for Rich Bisaccia, if nothing else. And then finally, hitting the special teams. We had a couple battles there. We didn't end up ever getting a kicker battle, but Anders Carlson did drill that 57-yarder, which was very nice, and no real issues on the day. It maybe was a slow process on the blocked kick, but I don't know that I'm blaming Anders Carlson on that. I think that's more of a protection thing and in the operation before him. So we obviously have Anders Carlson. I battled really, really tightly on whether or not Daniel Whelan was going to make this roster. I personally would go with him, but most of those kicks, they've been using Pat O'Donnell to hold. And I think they're going to look to stabilize that for Anders Carlson going into the year. So Pat O'Donnell will be our punter yet again. And then our long snapper, most of what I saw out there for at least kicks was Matt Orzik. So I think he had an edge on that position as well. So we're going to end up letting go of Daniel Whelan and Broughton Hatcher as well. So what that looks like for a breakdown of the roster is we've got 2 quarterbacks, 3 running backs, 6 receivers, 4 tight ends and H-backs, 9 offensive linemen. On the defensive side, we've got 5 defensive linemen, 6 edges, 5 linebackers, 5 corners, and 5 safeties, and then 1 each for all the specialists. I mean, I think that's a relatively even breakout. Ends up with a few more guys on the defensive side than the offensive side, which is pretty standard for us. I think there's more injuries that generally occur on the defensive side of the ball than there are on the offensive side. So it's nice to have a little bit more depth there as well. But now let's move on to the practice squad. So we can keep up to 16 generally. I think we're going to keep 17 this year because I fully expect that we're going to keep Kenneth Odumegwu. It's essentially a free roster spot. I mean, yes, we pay him, but from my recollection, I don't think he counts against the cap. He just collects his salary as normally would. So if we are looking at 17 with Odumegwu, I'm going to start on the offensive side again, and we're obviously going to keep a quarterback. I wouldn't be surprised if Lou Nichols, for instance, he might also potentially just get redshirted by being put on the IR just to keep another spot available on the practice squad. So Lou Nichols is out with his shoulder. Patrick Taylor's been battling tough. Like, he ran the ball really well against Seattle again. Made a strong case for it. But I don't think there's as much of a market out there for Patrick Taylor as there would have been for Emmanuel Wilson, based on age, play style, things like that. He's not quite as dynamic, but he is very steady and reliable in what he does. So I'm sure the Packers will want to keep him around. And then Tyler Goodson, a dynamic guy, dealt with a little bit of an injury. Maybe keep him around the practice squad. I've spoken a couple times throughout videos of his play style reminding me a little bit of an Aaron Jones. So if something did happen to Aaron Jones, Tyler Goodson's that guy that you could call up and he can step in and do some of the same things. Not to the same, consistency and proficiency, but he would be able to step in and you wouldn't have to monumentally change things. He could still be that scat back to, AJ Dillon's power back. On the receiver side, we could have counted on, Grant DuBose, Bo Melton, Jadakiss Bonds, Cody Crest, Deuce Watts, or Dre Miller, who also did some work at tight end. I ended up going with Grant DuBose, who I think is going to be like the number 1 priority for the practice squad for them. I think they really like what he brings. I wouldn't be surprised if he ended up making the 53 actually, but just based on the timeline of when his injury was, I don't think he put enough out there on tape necessarily to get captured up by somebody else's practice squad. I'm sure people are just going to stick with their guys instead. I kept Bo Melton as well. Another good, strong preseason for him. He can continue to develop in the system. And then I also kept Deuce Watts. Moving on to the tight ends and H-backs, Tyler Davis is on the IR, so don't have to worry about him. The only guy that was really eligible here was Henry Pearson. And I went ahead and kept him for a couple of reasons. But, at one, I think Matt LaFleur would like to keep somebody to fill that fullback type position. And I think he showed enough from a developmental side, but not necessarily on the team side to make the roster. So I think they want to keep him around, and then he's just going to kind of be insurance for Josiah Deguara should anything happen to him. You can bring in Henry Pearson off the practice squad for a game or two, fill in for Deguara, or if it's a serious thing, you can call him up to the active roster for good, and then he can fill those same duties, and you don't have to change the offense. Because we really don't have a guy that's going to fill that H-back role the same way. Not like we had Dominic Daphne who could do the same kind of thing the last few years, Onto the offensive line, we had Kadeem Telford, Cole Schneider, James MP, Royce Newman, Luke Tenuta, and Gene DeLance. I really only kept Cole Schneider as a backup center who could probably be shifted to guard if need be. And then Luke Tenuta, who had a couple good performances out there at tackle as well. Just trying to balance some of that practice squad, bring some more depth to the interior as we've got a lot of tackle depth on the lineup, but then keep Tenuta because he performed well and can still develop into, a back of the roster guy potentially for next year. All right, on to the defense. The only guy I kept on the defensive line was Jonathan Ford. There was also Jason Lawan, Chris Slayton, Antonio Moultrie, but really just looking for that depth as like the big anchor in the middle of the line being Jonathan Ford. Those other guys didn't perform that role the same way. For edge, the only one that was left after I kept so many was Kenneth Odumegwu, and that's just a free roster spot. So I think they're going to keep him around, give him a chance. He's got all the physical tools. It's just like really lacking, the football experience and then just drilling in and getting the reps and being more of a technician as a pass rusher. So excited to see what he can continue to do and keep him around as part of that international player pathway. On the linebacker side, we had Jimmy Phillips Jr. and Keyshawn Banks, both of whom I kept based on they both performed really well during the preseason. You see them a lot, making plays, at the line of scrimmage or in the backfield, getting pressure on blitzes, things like that. Marvin Pierre just got here this past week. I don't know that they saw enough to want to keep him around necessarily. And Aaron Mosby was the other guy that I didn't really feel made the step to make this practice squad. At cornerback, you could possibly see somebody like Corey Ballentine sticking around on the active roster, but I really didn't want to add another guy to that active roster at cornerback because it was just going to be somebody that I was going to pull right away once Stokes is back. I do think, depending on how many they keep at cornerback, might be a little bit of a tell for how long of a road does Stokes still have ahead of him before he's going to be ready to come back. Hopefully it's just a short one, and hopefully they keep just a few guys for that reason, but we'll see. Who we had, though, was Corey Ballentine, William Hooper, Shamar John-Charles, Keandre Thomas, Tyrell Ford, and Elijah Hamilton. For me, I thought Shamar John-Charles played better than I expected him to this preseason, especially that first game. He was really out there getting around. He showed up in run support and making tackles a lot, but I didn't see as much on the coverage side for him. So I ended up going with William Hooper, who was one of the higher graded cornerbacks we had in that first preseason game from PFF. PFF didn't have grades out for today's game yet, but I did like what I saw from Hooper in today's game as well, so I kept him around. And then Keandre Thomas, who was also just very active in coverage and just had a good overall preseason, so I wanted to keep him around as well. At safety, you might have noticed that I didn't keep around Jonathan Owens. He did not grade out well this preseason, and I think that's why he started to take more of a backseat on some of the reps that he was taking with the first teams throughout as we progressed from that first preseason game through the rest of camp. You kind of saw that he was given an opportunity to seize that starting role, and it started to squander, and then they just came back to their baseline of Rudy Ford was the guy that they trusted a bit more in that spot. And the other guy was the guy, the hero of the day, if you will, Benny Sapp III, who, clinched the game with that interception. I liked a lot of what I saw from him, from a physical perspective, but it was just one of those things where the safety room was pretty crowded, and I think he's somebody that I would like to keep around for the practice squad just to be able to develop a bit. So I added him to my practice squad, and then we don't have enough spots for specialists. Last year we had Ramiz Ahmed, but that was with an older kicker. We're not going to keep a specialist on the practice squad this year, I don't think. I could maybe be talked into the idea of keeping Daniel Whelan around on the practice squad, and then, as he continues to progress, maybe as a holder, they make that switch partway through the season with Pat O'Donnell, but I don't think they're going to want to pull that rug out from Andres Carlson once they kind of get established throughout the season. So the breakdown for the practice squad was 1 quarterback, 3 running backs, 3 receivers, 1 tight end or H-back, really a fullback, 2 offensive linemen. On defense, 1 defensive lineman, 1 edge, 2 linebackers, 2 corners, and a safety. And that wraps up the practice squad. Just overall, let me know, what do you think about this 53-man roster and practice squad? Is this something that you'd be pretty, generally happy with from the Packers if this was the direction they went? Or, who would you have liked to keep, either on the active roster or the practice squad? Let me know in the comments below, and I'll see you in the next one.